This video is about a bit of background on consumer and producer surpluses, which you're going to be able to find in many different cases. So all I'm going to do now, I'm not going to answer any specific questions. I'm simply going to teach you what's a consumer surplus and what's a producer surplus. Now, let's start with the consumer surplus. Suppose we have a demand curve. And suppose that for whatever reason, the price is equal to P bar. The bar is just to make you think of it as a specific price. And where that price comes from is not important right now. Then at that price P bar, consumers buy Q bar units. What I would then like to know is what's consumers' total expense? And the answer, as it happens, is the area corresponding to this rectangle underneath the price to the left of the quantity. This is what we call total expense. And I will explain shortly why that's the case. But it's very easy to figure out. The reason why that's total expense is that what must be total expense in general from an economic point of view, and the answer is that must be the number of units that consumers have bought, that's Q bar, times the price they have paid for each unit. If you have bought 100 units at a price of 5 kroner each, your total expense will be 500 kroner. It will be price times quantity. But the point then is that from a diagrammatic point of view, then the area of this rectangle underneath the price to the left of the quantity exactly has a height equal to P bar and a length equal to Q bar. And when in a rectangle you multiply the height and the length, you get the area. So the area of this rectangle corresponds to the total expense of consumers. In other words, we can, so to speak, get a graphical expression. We can, so to see to the total expense of consumers because it corresponds to this area. Now, that then is what consumers actually pay. The next thing I would like to ask is, what are consumers willing to pay? And the answer, and I will explain it shortly, but I will first tell you, the answer is the area underneath the demand curve to the left of the quantity. This we call the total willingness to pay, which you really only want to write once in your life unless you teach microeconomics. So we normally abbreviate it TWP. Why then is that? And the answer is, that is the case because suppose the price had a value corresponding up here to there being demanded only 1 unit. What that then tells me, the fact that if the price has this value, 1 unit is being demanded. What that then tells me is that somewhere in the real world there is a person walking around wanting to pay this much, the vertical distance onto the demand curve at unit number 1. Because if at this price 1 unit is being demanded, it must be because there is somebody in the real world who wants to pay this much. Likewise, if I lower the price slightly to the vertical distance corresponding here to unit number 2, then what that tells me from an economic point of view, first of all, of course, is that at that price 2 units are being demanded. But what it also tells me is that the person buying unit number 2 must be willing to pay this much, the difference between my index fingers here, the vertical distance onto the demand curve, because it was exactly by lowering the price onto that value that an additional unit was being demanded. What you need to realize now in general is that if at each unit of the good here, you look at the vertical distance onto the demand curve, my left index finger here moves 1 unit at a time. If you look at the vertical distance onto the demand curve at each individual unit, you will get the price which that person buying that exact unit is willing to pay. And if you then take the amount that the person willing to pay the most is willing to pay, and add to that the amount of the person who's willing to pay the second most, the third most, and so forth, and add it all together, what do you get? And the answer is, graphically, you get the area underneath the demand curve. And from an economic point of view, you get the total willingness to pay. Now, what that then shows us is that this area here, the area corresponding to the difference between the total willingness to pay, the entire area underneath the demand curve, and the area of the rectangle, the actual expense of consumers, that must correspond to how much consumers have saved compared to what they are willing to pay. And that we call the consumer surplus, or and abbreviated CS. And that's how to find the consumer surplus. And when you teach students this the first time, hopefully this is not the first time you hear it, but when you teach people this the first time, at least some students sometimes think that it's a weird concept that has really no bearing in the real world. And just to make you understand and remember this, I will talk briefly about why that's not the case, why this is actually a very, very normal day experience that you just usually don't pay attention to. So in order to make you pay attention to it, I want you to think back to the last time you left a shop after having bought something. It doesn't matter what, anything will do. Let's say a pair of jeans, but it's really not important. Then what you probably didn't do on the way out of the shop after having bought those jeans, what you probably didn't do, but what I would like to imagine that you had done, is to imagine that you had asked yourself the following question. Namely, what I now paid in that shop for that particular pair of jeans, was that the absolute maximum of what I was willing to pay? You probably didn't ask yourself that question, but if you had asked yourself that question, I'm pretty sure the answer would have been no. I would also have paid those jeans had they cost, let's say, 8 kroner more. Well, if that's the case, then you are just the person having bought that particular pair of jeans down here, where the vertical distance here between what you did pay and what you were willing to pay was 8 kroner. In other words, by buying that pair of jeans, you obtained a consumer surplus. You saved something in what you paid compared to what you were willing to pay. And if the answer to your question is 8 kroner, then you had a consumption surplus of exactly 8 kroner. And all we do when we find the consumer surplus is we simply take that amount, that vertical distance, and add it together for all the individual units of the good which have been bought, and that gives us the consumer surplus. And then the point is that we think of the consumer surplus as a sort of welfare on the part of consumers, a welfare in the sense that if you can buy an amount of good at a lower expense than what you're willing to pay, then surely you have gained some sort of welfare. And that's what we're going to use the consumer surplus for. It's to figure out what's consumers' welfare associated with buying goods in a market. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to talk about producers. So imagine that we have a supply curve. And imagine that for whatever reason, there is a price of the good equal to P bar. Again, the bar is just to make you think of it as a specific one. Then at that price, producers sell a total amount equal to Q bar. Then I would like to know what's producers' total revenue. And the answer is, well, since revenue, which is the amount of money you get when selling the goods, since revenue is the quantity you sell, the number of units you sell, times the price at which you sell each, in other words, price times quantity, it will correspond graphically here to the area of this rectangle, since the rectangle has a height equal to the price and a length equal to the quantity. In other words, the area of that rectangle will be total revenue. And that one doesn't work anymore. The next question I want to ask is, what produces firms' total cost? And immediately when you get that question, it seems like a question which is impossible to answer. But hopefully that is only until you remember, as I went through in one of the introductory videos. It is hopefully only until you remember that the supply curve is positioned graphically in exactly the same place as the marginal cost curve. In other words, when we know where the supply curve lies, we also know where the marginal cost curve lies. And also remember that if you read the marginal cost curve vertically, that means if at each individual unit you look here at the vertical distance onto the MC curve, then you get the cost of producing that particular unit. And what that must then mean is that if you take the cost of producing unit number 1 and add to that the cost of producing unit number 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and so forth, what do you get? And the answer is graphically you get the area underneath the marginal cost curve. And from an economic point of view, you get total cost. And please leave some room in between here, because if this is going to be absolutely correct, it should be total variable cost. The reason being that, as we shall see later on, there is also something called fixed cost. A fixed cost is a cost which you have to pay before starting production of the very first unit. For instance, you might first, before you have produced the very first unit, you might have to first build a factory at a cost of 10 million. And that's the fixed cost. And you can't see that in the diagram here. What you can see in the diagram by reading off the marginal cost curve is you can see that after you've built the factory, then what does it cost to produce the first, the second, the third, and so forth unit. But you can't see the fixed cost. You can't see the cost of building the factory, and that's why if this is going to be absolutely correct, and it should, we should think about it as variable cost. But right now, just think about it as cost. And then looking at the sketch, we can see that if we look at the total revenue and the total cost, that there is a surplus here of revenue over cost corresponding to the area up here, and that is exactly what we call the producer surplus. And as opposed to the consumer surplus, which some students sometimes think is a bit odd, then there is at least absolutely nothing odd about the producer surplus. It's simply the difference between the revenue of firms and the total, if it's going to be absolutely correct, variable cost. But the nice thing is that we can get a graphical impression of that. We can sketch the producer surplus, which, by the way, we will also think about, as we do with the consumer surplus, we will think about it as a sort of welfare, but this welfare, of course, being welfare for producers. And this concludes the background on producer and consumer surpluses.